I want to show you just a few examples of some student work for depth of field. These are from previous assignments, and in some of them they experimented with photographing the same object with various depths of field. I'm just going to show you some of the strongest ones of those, and in others they were just working towards using deep or shallow depth of field or both to explore an area or various subjects. So I just want to start with this one. This is a photograph of a mobile that this student took in her home, and you can see she used shallow depth of field to pull out the detail of the dragonfly on the mobile right in the front. Falls off almost right away so that this back dragonfly, or sorry, excuse me, the dragonfly in the front is actually out of focus. Then this one is in focus, and then things start to fall off. The background, which has a painting and a chair, is so out of focus that it becomes just a wonderful sort of colorful backdrop. Really nice use to focus our attention on the single dragonfly. This student was actually experimenting with these tomatoes with different depths of field, and this one was one of the ones she turned in, where she just photographed a row of tomatoes with photographing very close, so getting close to her subject, and with a wider aperture. It looks like a wider angle lens, and one of the things I want to take a look at here, we'll just go ahead and move into develop. So yes, she's at a 34 millimeter lens, which is not too long. f4.5, which isn't that wide, but it's probably the widest aperture she has available on this lens. And the trick is that she's gotten very, very close. So she's got a sort of a wide angle lens, but a very wide aperture for the lens. And then she's gotten very, very close for her focus. So her focus is right here in front of the camera. And that's given her this very lovely shallow depth of field. Same thing here. This actually, when you look at the technical data, this is really interesting. It's a really beautiful photograph emphasizing these bright green leaves in the front. We have just enough depth of field so we can see what's in the background, but it is shallow enough so that these definitely stay important and the background falls out. And this is actually interesting because it's an 18 millimeter lens. That's a very wide angle lens and will naturally give you a deeper depth of field. But she went to f3.5, and again, she focused very, very close to the camera, and that gave her just enough shallow depth of field to throw her background out of focus and focus attention on the leaves. Very nice here, focusing attention on the chain link and throwing what's beyond the chain link out of focus. Again, we don't have the data on this one, but this is focusing very, very close with what looks like to be a moderate lens and with a wide aperture. Same thing here, really nice, throwing the background out of focus. And I really love that she found something where she has a lot of this interesting detail on the foreground, made it large enough by getting close enough, not only to give the shallow depth of field, but to actually put that background behind it. And a final one here, similar strategy. Beautiful autumn. Now remember that there are levels of depth of field. Sometimes the depth of field is so shallow that everything behind a subject is just completely and utterly blurred out and you can't make it out. Other times it's just a little bit softer, as in this one. And it looks like I don't have the data for this one, but it creates a nice contrast. So we have both the contrast of the focus and the contrast of the color, which really draws your attention to the leaves in the foreground. Love this. This student did all of his work for this particular assignment on this newborn baby. This was my favorite. Just focusing attention in the very, very, very foreground on the baby's feet and the hands surrounding it with the rings. The baby you can still make out that this is a baby, but his face has fallen out of focus. Really, really lovely composition and terrific use of depth of field. This is a little more subtle, but I love this. This is actually tricky to do. This is 50 millimeter lens, which is a medium lens at f2.8, which is a very wide aperture. Now, it is not that it's maybe as shallow a depth of field as you might expect, and that's because the photographer is not as close to the subject that's in focus as she might have been. So we've got this nice sharp focus here, and it does start falling off right away, but it stays, it goes out of focus, but it stays moderately readable. What I like about this is the way that we move from sharp, medium, and more blurred, so that we really see that not only in terms of technically the depth of field falling off, but also compositionally. Very nicely done. Oh, I thought this was just lovely. And of course it's birds, and have a weakness for birds. But this student actually was using a very long aperture, or very long focal length, 135. The aperture is not very big, it's only 5.6, but it doesn't matter because that focal length is so long. She's not that close to the subject, which is the swallow on the branch, but just enough so that she pops it out and puts this wonderful picture of the swallow in the background out, and the clouds are a little bit soft as well. Really nice use of depth of field. This student it's great. This is another example of, this is a wider angle lens, which is sometimes harder to get deep depth of field. So this student got down on the ground and got really, really close, and has this wonderful slice of focus right here, just a little bit away. Foreground is out of focus. This is slices in focus, and then it falls off after that. And we'll see 32 millimeters, fairly wide. F4, which is not that wide an aperture, but it is wide, and it's wide enough to create this shallow depth of field because she got so close. Nicely done. Nicely done. The same kind of thing here, where we have this large object out of focus in the foreground, some of the lavender in focus, or I guess it's a salvia in focus, and then falling off behind. Now, it's really interesting. We looked at the Martin Parr and Rebecca Norris Webb, who very deliberately put their foreground out of focus, and so that technically you have a deep depth of field, except that the foreground object is so close that, that it goes out of focus. Because you can see in this one that this student did, this foreground, the bench is out of focus at all the way to the end, but it's getting sharper here, and then somewhere around here the depth of field, the focus gets very, very sharp, and it stays super sharp all the way out to the end. And that makes sense. I think this is a wide angle lens. I don't have the information on the aperture, but it looks like it is actually a pretty small aperture. Now, the other thing I'll point out about this, technically, let me make sure that stays in there, is that if you are trying to maximize your depth of field, you actually don't want to focus on the subject right in front of you, but you would want to focus probably to here. This is something, it's a little more advanced with depth of field, and I'll try to cover it a little bit later, at least in discussion, that you actually need to focus about 1/3 of the way into the area that you want to have in focus. In this case, the student went way beyond that, so the foreground is out of focus, but the background all falls within it. Same thing here. I love this really interesting photograph that technically has a great deal of depth of field, but just this little bit of this object, the rail that is right in front of us, goes out of focus. And this is 28 millimeters, very wide angle. This is actually f11, and so the aperture is very small, and yet we still lose the depth of field here. Tricky scene. He probably would have needed to focus just a little bit closer in and maybe shut down his aperture some more, kind of tweak it back and forth to get that absolute depth of field. But this is actually a very challenging thing to get all the way in focus. Now, I wanted to show you another one, speaking of foregrounds going out. So this is another in the series of the first one. She's catching a different part of that of that mobile, and she's thrown it completely out of focus and focused on the painting behind. And I thought that was so interesting because it begins to look very much like a shadow when in fact it is the object. So again, reversing this depth of field and focusing on the background rather than on the foreground. Okay, and I have a few examples of deep depth of field. Oftentimes we forget that deep depth of field is as intriguing and important and expressive as shallow depth of field. So in this wonderful sort of slice of life, just this little sort of ordinary corner with the fence, this student has put the fence with its really interesting cross wires, sharp focus here, all the way out to the back. And sure enough, 32 millimeters, f/16, not too close to the area where he focused. Really beautiful golden hour photograph. This student, she converted this to black and white, which I think is a great choice. And she is on this, focused about a third of the way into the scene on this tree. She is only at f/6.3, but because the tree is far enough from her, from where she's focused, oops, I did this again, she's managing to keep a very nice depth of field. Very sharp here, and we'll probably lose it just a little bit out here, but the effect is of a very deep depth of field. Another one by the same photographer, this is at Lagoon Valley, and yeah, similar settings, and she's losing the focus just the tiniest bit out here, but because she's using a wider angle lens and focusing slightly far from her, she manages to keep this wonderful deep depth of field with the foreground and the background. Another one by that same student, really lovely path. I love this, that if we zoom in on this foreground, there's detail, it's all sharp here in the foreground. We zoom out to the back and it just barely starts getting soft out there. So we really have the narrative from the front of the path all the way down the path and out into the background. This is a great example of layering. This is 33 millimeters, so it's relatively wide, but I love the fact that this photographer layered all these objects and left them all in focus. So we have the grass, and then the goalpost, the sign, the fence, and the trees. And every single one of them, we can see them layered, stacked one on top of the other. They all feel sort of equally important, which creates this really interesting composition and design. Another great architectural shot from up on a hill makes it much easier to get deep depth of field if you're a little bit away from your subject. And I believe this is the last one. This may not look like the most exciting photo, but I was so impressed with this photo. This was one of my younger students, and he took this photograph on the kitchen counter, and his goal was to get this beautiful depth of field, all the way from the crumb on the counter here, to the mustard, to the bowl, and all the way out to the window, and even to the fence outside of the window. Everything is in sharp focus, telling that narrative. Very hard to do if you get up close to something. He went with a 12 millimeter lens, f/14, and a fairly long shutter speed. But the trick to this is that he maximized two things: his focal length and his aperture, so that he could still get close and still maintain that deep depth of field. Okay, I hope that gives you some inspiration, and have a fun time playing with depth of field.